The intake log said she came in with a lateral laceration, left thoracic wall, approximately 9 centimeters, sustained during field capture. It said she had been assessed by the field medic and stabilized for transport. It said her species designation was Twelfth, her classification tag was Vashti Kaur, and her threat rating was filed as Standard Detainee Category 2. I read all of that while I was walking down the corridor, because that was how mornings worked on Sarah Voss. You read the intake sheet on the move. You did not stop. Stops were for emergencies and lunch, and this was neither. The orbital platform was 15 years old and showed it. The composite panel ceiling in the medical wing diffused the daylight array into a broad, even brightness. No shadows, no warmth, just the flat efficiency of light designed by committee. My boots made the same sound they always made on the deck plating. A short, dry click with each step. The kind of sound that after 2 years you stopped hearing. I was counting the click count to the intake suite. 37 from the corridor junction. I had counted them enough times to know. I pushed through the door at 38. My count was off by 1, because I had taken a slightly longer stride somewhere in the last stretch and had not noticed. That was the kind of thing that happened when you were not paying attention, and on Sarah Voss, you learned to notice the things that were off by 1, because they usually meant something had shifted somewhere upstream. 37 was the count when I was walking normally. 38 meant my head was somewhere else. The intake suite was a room 12 meters long and 5 wide, with 4 treatment bays divided by half-height partition screens that were theoretically for patient privacy and practically for giving the orderlies somewhere to clip their gear while they worked. Bay 1 was empty. Bay 2 had the Televar patient I had seen yesterday, a low-grade bone stress fracture in the left forearm, already healing well enough that I expected to clear him for standard movement restrictions at tomorrow's follow-up. Bay 3 was empty. Bay 4 had a privacy screen drawn all the way across. The duty orderly, a young man named Seth, who had been on Sarah Voss for 4 months and still flinched when the atmospheric processors cycled, was standing outside Bay 4 with a clipboard and an expression I had seen before on people who had just encountered something they did not quite know how to file. Cormandovi, he said. Seth. I reached for the clipboard. What do we have? Field laceration, lateral thoracic, left side. Assessment notes say it was a clean puncture exit from a restraint bolt. Medic on scene said the wound was open but not actively bleeding by the time they got to her. Cleaned it, packed it, handed her off. Age? The classification form has her listed as adult, mature stage. No more specific than that. He paused. She has not said anything. Since she came in. They said she had not said anything the whole transport. 3 hours. I looked at the clipboard. The Vashti Kaur tag was a field designation. I had seen it before. The processing teams used it when they did not have a species-specific identity on hand. It was a placeholder, not a name. The intake sheet was otherwise unremarkable. Species: Varathkai. Threat category: 2. Physical measurements were in the upper portion of the Varathkai adult range, which I noted and filed as a fact I would need to account for in the suture pressure. Height: 2.07 meters. Mass 142 kilograms. Bone density approximation 2.1 times the human standard. Vitals? Stable. Resting rate slightly elevated but within tolerances for Varathkai physiology. Temperature reads about 3 degrees above the human baseline, which the field notes say is within their normal range. I handed the clipboard back and pulled on a fresh pair of gloves. I want to say something about Sarah Voss before I go further, because where you work shapes how you work. And 2 years on a platform like that does things to your reflexes that you do not always notice until you are somewhere else, and you catch yourself doing them by habit. Sarah Voss was a detention and processing annex, not a prison. Exactly the distinction mattered administratively, even if it did not matter in any practical sense to the people being processed there. It was the point between field capture and whatever came next. which might be a Federation detention facility on a core world platform, or a transfer back to a home system jurisdiction under one of the bilateral agreements that the Federation had spent 30 years negotiating with varying degrees of success, or occasionally something else that was not discussed explicitly with the intake medics. We treated the people who came through. We documented what we found. We kept them in a condition consistent with their rights under the applicable statutes. That was the job. What that meant in practice was that you treated a very wide range of species in a very wide range of conditions, usually within a few hours of a field capture, usually with incomplete information about what the capture had involved, and usually without any way to establish the kind of patient rapport that most medical training assumes you will have. You learn to work without it. You learn to read what the body gave you, and not require the patient to give you more. You learn to be precise and clean, and to note what you observed without editorializing, because the editorializing would come from somewhere else up the chain, and it was not your function to preempt it. You also learned, after enough time, the particular quality of attention that a newly captured field patient brought into the room with them. Not all of them. Some were exhausted, some were in shock, some were simply waiting out a process they had accepted as the current reality. But some of them, the ones who were neither broken nor resigned, the ones who were simply watching those ones, had an attention that you felt before you could describe it. A quality of being observed before you observed them. She had that quality. There was a Televar ambassador's aide I had treated in my 9th month on Sarah Voss, a man who had been in intelligence work before the administrative posting, who came in with a hand laceration sustained from a processing door that had closed on his fingers. Routine presentation. He sat on the treatment surface and watched me work with a quality of attention that I found, at the time, slightly uncomfortable, in the way that precise attention from a patient is sometimes uncomfortable, because you become aware of yourself as an object being studied. He watched my hands. He watched the sequence of my decisions. He was not afraid and he was not hostile. He was simply noting everything. When I was done, and the hand was dressed, he said, very pleasantly, that I worked very cleanly, and that he had counted 4 unnecessary movements in the procedure, and wondered if that was standard. It was not hostile. It was just observation that had reached a conclusion, and he had decided to share the conclusion. I thought about him when I pulled the privacy screen aside in Bay 4. Not because she reminded me of him, she did not. The two were very different. The aide had been gregarious in a watchful way, and she was simply watchful, but because the quality in the room was the same quality. The sense of having already been partially processed before you arrived. That someone in the room had a running account of what was happening, and you were part of what was happening, and they were not particularly troubled by that. It was simply what they were doing. I had noticed it from the moment I came around the end of the treatment surface, and she was facing the wall. You can feel a quality of attention in a room, even when its source is not looking at you. She was facing the wall and she was not sedated, and she had been in the room for some time before I arrived, and in that time she had been paying attention to whatever was paying attention to her. Which, in the intake suite, was not very much. The atmospheric processors, the sound of the display screen on the orderly station, the particular acoustic quality of the deck plating when someone walked on it. She would have heard my count, 37 clicks from the corridor junction to the intake suite door. The Vorothkai hearing range was in the species file broader than the human range at the upper end, and the click of a boot on deck plating at 37 paces would be well within it. She would have heard the count and known from the regularity of it what it was. Someone who knew this corridor, walking it at their normal pace. Someone for whom the walk was ordinary. And then 38, because I had taken a longer stride somewhere in the last stretch. I have thought about whether she noticed that. Whether the discrepancy of 1 step in 38 was the kind of thing her attention would have flagged. I noticed it. I noticed it the way you notice. A small thing that is slightly off. Not with alarm, but with the quiet registration that something was slightly off. And I did not change anything I was doing because it was not a problem. Just a variance. An ordinary variance. I wonder if she filed it. Noted it. The medic who came to treat her walked a known corridor 37 steps at normal pace, and then took one longer step at the end without noticing. She had been reading me before I walked in the door. The privacy screen in Bay 4 had a slight drag on the left side from a bent runner that the maintenance log said had been reported 4 times and addressed twice. I pulled it aside. She was lying on the treatment surface on her left side, facing the wall. This was not the position I would have put her in for a lateral thoracic wound, but the restraint configuration had been adjusted to accommodate what she actually was. One wrist was in a soft restraint, not a hard lock, but a padded cuff attached to a rail at approximately hip height, and her legs were not restrained at all, which was standard for Category 2 detainees who had not been flagged as active threat. The Varithkai I had treated before were soldiers. I had seen 6 of them in my 2 years on Saravos, usually with injuries sustained during field capture. They were tall, broader in the shoulder than the human range, with a skeletal structure that read in scan as denser than I expected the first time, and which I had since learned to account for. Their musculature sat differently than human muscle, layered in a way that was not immediately obvious under the skin, but that you felt when you were working close. Their coloring was in the gray-blue range, varying by individual, and the skin had a slightly matte quality. 4 fingers on each hand, the thumb set further back toward the wrist. Eyes a pale amber or gold in the adults I had treated, the iris large and the pupil vertical in standard lighting. She was facing the wall. All I could see of her from the doorway was the line of her back, the left shoulder, and the shape of the wound beneath the field packing. Even from there, I could tell she was large in the upper range of the Varithkai adults I had treated. The bones of her shoulder, even at rest, had a solidity to them that made the treatment surface look slightly provisional. I came around the end of the surface to put the wound in reach and set my kit down on the instrument tray. Vashti Kaur, I said. It was not her name, I knew that, but it was what the form said. And I had found over 2 years that using the form designation when I did not have a name was better than calling a patient nothing at all. I am Kormandovi. I am going to take the field packing out and close the laceration. This will take approximately 20 minutes. Is there anything you want me to know before I begin? Standard intake question. I asked it to every patient. She did not move. She did not answer. I noted that and began. The field packing was well placed. Whoever had done it in the field knew what they were doing. Clean layers. Appropriate pressure. No overpacking. I removed it in the standard sequence and assessed the wound. 9 centimeters, as reported. Entry and exit margins reasonably clean. No active bleeding. Bruising on the skin to either side. The deep purplish gray of Varithkai coloration under impact, spreading in the pattern I expected from restraint bolt contact. I probed the depth, not reaching the pleural space, which was what I needed to confirm. I irrigated and prepared the suture setup. Curved needle, absorbable thread at the gauge I had learned, worked well with this tissue type. 12 passes, approximately. I am going to begin the closure now, I told the wall. You will feel pressure through the first several stitches, and then less as the wound approximates. Tell me if anything changes significantly. She said nothing. I began. The first stitch went in cleanly. The Varithkai tissue density required a fraction more pressure than I was used to applying at the needle. A small adjustment I had calibrated over previous patients. Thread through, margin approximated, not in the standard pattern. First stitch done. The second. The third. By the fourth, I had the full rhythm of the closure, and could work without adjusting my approach at each pass. Steady spacing, even tension. The hands knew the work. She lay still throughout. A chosen stillness, not sedation, not pain management. She was deciding not to move. I had seen this in field capture patients before, and I treated it as information without assigning it a meaning. I kept working. The fifth stitch. The sixth. There is a quality to suturing at this depth of familiarity with a task that is difficult to describe to people who have not experienced it. The procedure runs in the hands. Not thoughtlessly, the hands are attending to everything relevant: the spacing, the tension, the approximation, the quality of the tissue at each pass, but without the effort of directed attention. Directed attention would be slower and would introduce inconsistency. The hands had learned the procedure, and the mind was available for other things, which was why the narration came out automatically, and why I noticed, in a peripheral way, that the room felt as though it was being attended to more thoroughly than I was attending to it. I have tried to reconstruct what I was aware of, in that peripheral way, during the 5th and 6th stitches. The even sound of the atmospheric processors. The light quality in the bay. Flat and consistent. The position of her shoulder relative to where I was working, which had not changed since I came around the end of the treatment surface. The fact that her breathing was fully controlled, not the controlled breathing of pain management, where there is an effort to it, a deliberateness, but simply the breathing of someone who was breathing exactly as much as they needed to, and no more. I had not consciously noted that. It was in the peripheral record. The 7th stitch. The 8th. It occurs to me now that she was probably noting the same things about me. My breathing, my position relative to the wound, the consistency of my spacing between stitches, the fact that I narrated automatically, which told her the narration was not tactical, not an attempt to establish rapport or manage her response, but habitual. The vocabulary of someone doing routine work. She would have known, from the 8th stitch, what kind of medic I was. Not because she had any particular knowledge of medical practice, but because she had been in enough situations where people were performing tasks near her to know when someone was performing a task, and when someone was managing a situation. I was performing a task. She turned her head slightly. Not toward me. I could see the line of her jaw and part of the side of her face, but not her eye. She appeared to be looking at the instrument tray. I did not know what on the instrument tray she was looking at. I kept my attention on the wound and kept working. The 7th stitch. The 8th. She had been reading me since before I walked in the door. I did not know this at the time. I know it now, looking back at the 43 minutes between the procedure and the classification alert, and the hour I spent at the intake desk afterward, with the terminal in front of me and the afternoon schedule untouched. She had been reading me from 37 paces down the corridor, from the quality of my step on the deck plating, from the way I pulled the privacy screen aside, from the standard question I asked before beginning, which had the quality of a habitual question rather than a tactical one, from the way I narrated the procedure intermittently, automatically, the way you narrate something you have done many times without deciding to narrate it, from the pressure I applied to each stitch, which was even and consistent, and did not vary with the patient's responses, because there were no responses to vary with. She had been taking my measure for 12 stitches before the 12th stitch. The 9th. The 10th. Almost done, I said. Old habit. The words were out before I had consciously decided to say them. The 11th stitch. I placed the needle for the 12th. The pause between the 11th and 12th stitch was the natural pause, the brief resetting of grip and position, the reorientation to the final closure point, the small adjustment I made to the angle of approach for the last pass, because the final stitch in a 12-stitch closure always ran at a slightly different geometry to the preceding ones. Not much of a pause. A few seconds. Long enough for the hands to confirm the position, and the mind to confirm the spacing before the needle went in. I have thought about whether she noticed that pause, whether it was longer than the pauses between the other stitches, whether the pause itself was a datum she registered and filed. I do not know. The pause was the standard pause. It felt to me like every other interstitch pause in the sequence, but I was not the one for whom it was a datum. It went through the upper margin of the wound as cleanly as the others. I drew the thread through, felt the familiar resistance, began the pull to approximate the margins. The needle stopped. I do not mean I stopped it. I mean the motion I had been making, the steady, even pull I had been applying for 11 stitches, without variation, encountered something that was not what it had encountered at the 11th stitch, or the 10th, or any of the others. The thread was still in my fingers. The clamp was still in my hand. The motion had simply encountered a quality in the resistance that was different. I looked at the site. The wound margins had moved. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have been obvious from a step away, but at the distance I was working, 12 inches above the site with the needle in my hand and my full attention on the gap between the margins, it was unmistakable. The tissue had approximated. The distance between the upper and lower margins at the 12th stitch position was less than it had been 4 seconds ago, and the quality of the resistance in the thread was the resistance of tissue under gentle compression, not tissue being drawn across a gap. Two surfaces that had already begun to rest against each other. The wound was closing from the inside. I held the needle where it was. I have tried, many times since, to reconstruct exactly what I was doing in those 3 seconds. The honest answer is that my hands were holding what they held, and my mind was performing a classification. What I was looking at was outside the range of clinical phenomena I had observed in 9 years of medical work. And in those 3 seconds, my mind was working through the classification problem with the same methodical quality it brought to every clinical problem. What is this? What does it mean? And what does it change about the task? That process was running, but it was not yet complete. And while it was running, my hands stayed where the procedure had left them, because the procedure had not yet reached its conclusion, and the hands did not move from an incomplete procedure. That was simply how I worked. She turned her head. Now I could see her eye. It was the pale gold I knew from the other Varathkai patients, but lighter than any of them, almost the color of old bone, with very little of the amber warmth I was used to. The iris was large, and in the composite panel light the pupil had contracted to a thin vertical bar. She was not looking at my face. She was looking at my hands. Not at the wound, at my hands. The hand holding the clamp, and the hand holding the thread, both in exactly the position the procedure had left them, neither of them having moved. She looked at them with an expression I did not have a reference point for. Not threat assessment, I knew what that looked like in Varathkai patients. The particular attention they directed at you when they were calculating proximity and response time. This was quieter than that. This looked more like reading. She looked at my hands for 2 full seconds. Then she said, "Finish the stitch." 4 words. Flat and level, without inflection I could map to anything in my experience. Not a command in the way their commands sounded. I had heard Varathkai commands in the recordings in the species file. The authority that sat at the back of the throat and expanded. Not a request. Not the soft-edged quality of a patient asking for something. It was simply the plainest possible sentence that could be formed from the situation and the task. The most direct description of what needed to happen, and the direction to make it happen. Spoken at exactly the volume needed to reach me, and no further. Finish the stitch. I finished the stitch. My hands resumed the pull. The wound had approximated enough in the interval that the resistance was slightly greater, the tissue was closer together, and I applied the additional pressure smoothly and drew the thread through, tied the knot. 3 passes, 2 locks, the standard pattern. Clipped the excess thread at 4 millimeters above the knot. The closure was complete. 12 stitches, evenly spaced, the margins well approximated. It was a clean line. I put the clamp down. I peeled off the outer gloves and dressed the closure sterile gauze, adhesive backing, 1 long strip of surgical tape, and pressed the tape down along the upper margin of the dressing with my thumb, evenly. The way I always did. She was still watching my hands. "Closure is complete," I said. My voice was level. I noticed it was level in the way you notice something about yourself that you had not consciously produced. Dressing is applied. I will put a follow-up note in your chart for reassessment in 48 hours. Is there any pain? She did not answer. She turned her head back toward the wall. I gathered my kit, stripped the used materials onto the disposal sheet, bundled it, and opened the site log. 12 stitches, lateral thoracic laceration, left side, Closed without complication. I stood with the stylus over the observation field for a moment. Then I wrote, wound margins showed accelerated approximation during final suture. Advise species physiology review on file before reassessment. I closed the chart. I came back out of Bay 4 and found Seth at the orderly station. Done, I said. Note the chart observation for the species review team. He made a note without looking up. I poured water from the station pitcher, drank half of it, and stood at the window for a moment. The composite panel daylight was better there, more direct. I looked out at the docking arm on the platform's sunward side. A supply transport was cycling in on its approach run, small enough at this distance to read as a white smear against the pale of the star. I watched it for a few seconds, and then went to Bay 2 to check the Televar patient's arm. 43 minutes later, I was at the intake desk, updating the afternoon schedule when the alert flag came through on the classification terminal. I saw Seth's head come up from across the room. I looked at the terminal. The alert was from the Federation Classification Authority, relayed through the standard intelligence cross-reference that ran on a lag whenever a new intake species designation was entered into the system. The Varathkai flag had triggered a secondary biometric review. The secondary review had cross-referenced the physical metrics from the scan taken at field, capture all the numbers I had read on the intake sheet this morning, and noted without concern because they were within the known. Varathkai adult range, if at the upper end of it, height 2.07 meters, mass 142 kilograms, bone density 2.1 times human standard. The cross-reference result was on the terminal. Varathkai caste marker. Empress militant classification. Biometric confidence. 97.3%. I read it twice. The Varathkai were a species of inherited military sovereignty. Their rank was not appointed or trained, it was biological, expressed in bone density, musculature structure, and a suite of physiological markers that varied by caste in documented, measurable ways. The higher the caste, the more pronounced the difference from the general population. The Empress militant caste was the apex. Not a symbolic title, not an administrative function. The Empress militant of the Varathkai was the greatest living warrior of her people, not because any authority said so, but because the body said so. I had read the species file in my first month on Sarah Voss. The biological markers section had been precise. The Empress militant caste carried subdermal musculature density approximately 2.5 times the Varathkai standard, and a subdermal vascular structure adapted for wound closure on timescales. The file described as markedly accelerated relative to all known Varathkai castes and all known humanoid species. The vascular structure contracted and approximated tissue autonomously in response to damage, working from the deepest layers outward. In the Empress militant, the response was most pronounced of all documented castes. The wound margins had moved. The 12th stitch. The needle caught in closing flesh. 3 seconds. 4 words. I sat with that for a moment and let it be what it was. I had been suturing the most dangerous living warrior of an aggressive spacefaring species. Alone, in a curtained bay, with one wrist in a soft restraint cuff that a woman who had fought 614 engagements over 41 years would not have found challenging. She had decided the cuff should hold her. She had made that decision and held it through 20 minutes of a medical procedure performed by someone who had no idea what they were holding. And then on the 12th stitch, the needle stopped. I thought about what that change had looked like from her side. She was an Empress militant. She had been in wounds before, dozens of them, hundreds, across 41 years. Every wound she had sustained, her body had begun closing from the inside in the same way. And in every one of those wounds, the people present when the tissue moved had known what she was, either because they already knew, or because the tissue moving told them, and they had responded. She had described the responses to me: withdrawal, reassessment, reorientation. One person had screamed. In every case, the moment of recognition had become the thing that was happening. The new frame that reorganized everything around it. The geometry of the room changing around her, every time, because the room understood what she was. Until the 12th stitch. I flagged the alert for the station commander's office and the intelligence liaison and filled out the standard escalation form. In the incident remarks, I noted that the medical intake had been completed without event. This was accurate. No event had occurred in Bay 4 that morning. A procedure had been completed. An observation had been made and documented. I did not note what she had said. I thought about it whether I was obligated to record it. 4 words, spoken in a curtained intake bay, addressed to my hands. I thought about what those 4 words looked like in a security review report, stripped of the context of where the needle was and what the tissue was doing and what the hands had been doing before she said them. Whether finish the stitch read as a threat, or a command, or a signal of some kind, in the hands of people who had not been in that bay. I left the remarks field as I had written it. Medical intake completed without event. I finished the afternoon schedule updates and went to check on the Televar patient's arm. The fracture was healing well. I changed the support wrapping, noted the improvement, and told the patient, a young male who was frightened of the platform, and showed it by asking small, nervous questions in careful Federation standard, that the bone would be functional in approximately 3 more weeks. He asked if he would be transferred before the 3 weeks were up. I told him I did not know, which was true, and he nodded in the way people nod when they already knew the answer to a question and asked it anyway, because the asking was the thing they needed to do. I went back to the intake desk and caught up on the filing. There were 4 charts from the morning that needed updating, which I updated, and 2 requests from the processing office on level 3 for medical documentation related to cases I had cleared last week, which I pulled and forwarded. The afternoon was ordinary in the way that most afternoons on Saravos were ordinary, a series of small administrative tasks that constituted the bureaucratic shell around a medical function. The function was treating people. The shell was everything else that surrounded treating people and made the treating possible, and made the record of the treating exist in the system, in a form that the system could use. I have found, over time, that I am good at both, the treating and the shell. This is not universally true of medical staff. Some people are better at one than the other, and the best are either very good at both or very good at one, and very good at finding someone who compensates for the other. I am fairly even across both, which makes me a competent intake medic for a platform like Sarah Voss, and probably a less interesting person than I might otherwise be. The review at 1400 hours was conducted by a lieutenant commander named Hayes, who ran security assessment for this sector of the platform. 2 colleagues I did not know. A recording device on the table between us. She asked me to walk through the intake procedure from arrival to completion. I did so in the same flat sequence I used for all clinical reports. Entry, assessment, irrigation, closure, stitch by stitch, the change in tissue behavior at stitch 12, the observation, the completion of the closure, the dressing, the chart note. I described what I had observed at close working distance. I described that I had held the needle in place while I processed the observation, and then completed the closure. At the point when you observed the change in tissue behavior, Hayes said, what was your assessment of the situation? Clinical, I said. I was assessing how to complete the closure cleanly given the change in tissue mechanics. Did you feel at risk? No. I paused. My concern was procedural throughout. Did she say anything during the procedure? I looked at the recording device on the table. I thought about the intelligence team behind Hayes and what they would do with 4 words. I thought about how finish the stitch would read in a security review report, and what the word command would add to a file that was already going to be classified in ways I would not be informed about. She was nonverbal throughout the procedure, I said. This was accurate. Hayes looked at me for a moment with the filing expression and made a note. The review concluded at 1450. At 1720, Seth came to tell me that the prisoner in Bay 4 had asked to speak to the medic from the morning procedure. I thought about that request while I was pulling on the gloves. She was the most dangerous living warrior of her species, held in a soft restraint cuff that she had chosen to let hold her, in a bay on a platform that was now responding to her classification with the full weight of the appropriate protocols. She had not asked for a lawyer, or an interpreter, or a representative of her species' diplomatic apparatus, or anything else that the processing documentation listed as a standard right of a newly classified detainee. She had asked for the medic from the morning procedure, by name. I have wondered what she would have done if I had not come. If I had sent word through Gallo that I was not obligated and had chosen not to respond, I do not think she would have asked again. I think she would have noted it as another data point in the pattern. The medic who had finished the stitch did not come when asked, and she would have added it to the picture she was building of me, which would have been a more complete picture than I had of myself. She would have simply added the absence, and the picture would have been less interesting. I went. I walked the corridor. The count was 37. She had used my name. She had heard it once, said once by me, in a 40-second greeting, at the start of a procedure, while she was facing the wall. She had noted it, filed it, used it when she needed it. I pulled on a fresh pair of gloves and walked the 37 clicks to Bay 4. Gallo was in the corridor and nodded. Both her legs were now restrained, the protocol upgrade that came with the classification. Her left wrist was still in the soft cuff. The treatment surface was at 30 degrees. She was looking at the ceiling. When I came in, she turned her head the full turn this time, not the partial, and looked at my hands first. Then my face. Cormandovi, she said. Empress militant, I said. A pause. You received the classification 43 minutes after the procedure. She considered that. I have been in 614 engagements, she said. 41 years of operational service. In those engagements, I sustained wounds on 132 occasions. In a number of those, I was in enemy hands when the wound was being treated. She said it the way you state a verified sequence. In each of those cases, the person treating the wound encountered the tissue response. Each of them responded to it. How? They withdrew, or called for others, or ceased what they were doing and reassessed their position in relation to me. One of them screamed. That was an outlier. She kept looking at my face. In each case, the moment of recognition became the thing that was happening. Everything else reorganized around it. I said, the stitch needed finishing. The same long pause she had given me when I said it the first time. Yes, she said. It did. She turned her head toward the ceiling again. You held still for approximately 3 seconds after the needle stopped. You did not withdraw. You did not call for anyone. When I told you to finish the stitch, you finished it. Yes. I want to know, she said. What was happening in those 3 seconds? I thought about it carefully. I had been thinking about it for the hours between the procedure and this conversation, and I had arrived at an answer I believed was accurate. I was processing an observation, I said. The wound was behaving differently than wounds behave. I was working out what that meant for the completion of the closure. The process was running. It was not yet complete. While it was running, my hands stayed where the procedure had left them, because the procedure had not yet reached its conclusion. You were not afraid. Not in those 3 seconds. I was attending. She was quiet for a moment. The composite panel daylight fell on the dressing at her left side, undisturbed. All 12 stitches were holding correctly. In 614 engagements, she said, I have faced beings who were afraid of me, and beings who were not afraid of me. The beings who were not afraid were the ones I watched most closely. Their lack of fear was not an absence, it was a presence, a calculation, a weapon, a position, an advantage they were certain of. Their calm was tactical. I understood it because I have the same calm, and I know what it rests on. She paused. You had none of those things. You had a needle and a piece of thread, and a knot to tie. I said. Something shifted in the stillness. Not a smile. I did not know what Varathkai faces did with that signal, but a quality in the tension that released a small fraction. Yes, she said. And a knot to tie. She turned her head back toward the ceiling. The follow-up is in 48 hours, I said. I will be here. She said nothing. I went back out through the partial screen, noted the encounter in the security log at Gallows Station, and completed my shift. She was transferred off Sarah Voss 11 days after the intake. I was not informed of where or what the outcome was of the intelligence process that a captured Empress militant triggers in the Federation's operational hierarchy. That was not information that came to intake medics, and I had not expected it to. What I had was a closed chart. 12 stitches. Lateral thoracic laceration. Left side. No complications. Follow-up at 48 hours. Wound presenting well. Suture removal completed without incident. And in the observation field of the procedure note, in my own handwriting, wound margins showed accelerated approximation during final suture. Final suture. Not the series. Not the 11 that came before. The one I was in the middle of when the needle stopped, and she turned her head and looked at my hands and waited to see what the hands would do. I have thought about those 3 seconds many times in the years since, with the persistence of something that has a shape you keep finding yourself tracing. 614 engagements, 132 wounds, 41 years of being, in every room she occupied, the most dangerous thing in it, and in every one of those wounds. The moment the tissue moved, and whoever was holding the instrument registered what they were looking at, the recognition became the frame. The room reorganized. The people in it became different people. People who knew what they were standing next to. Until a Tuesday morning in the flat composite panel daylight of a detention platform intake bay, when a corpsman second class held a needle enclosing flesh for 3 seconds, and kept their hands where the procedure had left them. I have no clean account of why I held still. I have thought about it enough to know it was not bravery. Bravery implies a calculation made against fear, a choice. And I do not think I made a choice in those 3 seconds so much as continued what was already in progress. The hands were in the middle of a procedure. The procedure had a next step. The next step was the knot. She tested it, because she needed to know which kind of still it was. She said 4 words and waited to see if the motion resumed. If it did not resume, if I pulled the needle free and began to become the kind of person who had recognized what they were, in the presence of, then the 4 words had broken whatever was holding the hands still, and the result was the same as it had always been. And if the motion resumed, the 4 words had confirmed something she had not been able to confirm before. I resumed the motion. The knot was tight. The closure was clean. She had been in 614 engagements, and in every one of them, she had understood exactly what every being in the room was doing and why. The Varathkai build their understanding of other species the way they build everything else systematically, from observed data, without the overlay of preference or hope that tends to distort assessment in species more accustomed to diplomacy than to conflict. You are what your actions say you are. The pattern of your actions under pressure tells them what they need to know. And the Empress militant, over 41 years and 614 engagements, had built a comprehensive pattern map of what beings did when they recognized what she was. The map was consistent. The map had not had an exception until the 12th stitch. I have wondered, in the years since, whether she did anything with the exception, whether it changed any part of the pattern map, or whether it was filed as an outlier. The medic who was in the middle of a procedure, and whose hands did not lift because the procedure was the frame, and nothing she had done or been had broken through the procedure's frame to become the new frame, an outlier, not a new category. One corpsman, second class, on a Tuesday morning, on a detention platform above a system whose name I no longer remember. I hope it was more than an outlier to her. I have no way of knowing. That was part of what it meant to be the apex of what she was, and I think what she had not encountered until that morning was what it looked like when the person on the other side of the needle was not doing anything about her at all. when the recognition was running but had not yet finished, and the hands were simply waiting for it to finish. In the same position the procedure had left them, the thread hanging loose between my fingers, the needle caught in closing flesh. 3 seconds of nothing changing. Finish the stitch. She said it, and the mind finished the classification. And the result of the classification was that the next step was still the knot. Not because the classification had not changed anything, it had changed the way I understood everything that had preceded it, and everything that would follow it, but because the task was not yet complete, and the task had a next step. And I knew the next step, and the hands were already in position. The knot was tight and even. The closure was clean. I had learned what she was, and I had learned it with the thread already in my hands. And by the time the full weight of it arrived, the work was done. The chart is still in the system, as far as I know. 12 stitches, lateral thoracic laceration, left side, closed without complication. Observation field. Wound margins showed accelerated approximation during final suture. Advise species physiology review on file before reassessment. No name in any system that would have meant anything to the people who later used the file. Just a placeholder tag and a procedure note, and the fact of the suture line, holding clean and even, the way a closure holds when the hands that made it knew what they were doing and did not stop until the work was finished.